This experience happened when I was wild camping alone in a forest in Wales. I live in England near the Welsh border. I've done this dozens of times and continue to do so. It was April or May in 2014 and the weather was unseasonably good. This was the second of 3 planned nights for my trip, but it ended up being the last. The first night and second day had been great. I enjoyed a lovely long hike followed by a pub lunch. I drove back to my camping area and settled in for the night. I read a book, had some beers, and went to sleep between 11 p.m. and midnight. I was in that semi-conscious state, about to drift off but not quite there yet. I slowly became aware of a melodic noise outside the tent. It didn't sound close, maybe within 50 feet. It sounded like a person perfectly humming a tune. After a few minutes, I was sure it was someone humming. When I say perfectly, I mean it sounded like a professional singer. No voice breaks or falters. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. I was terrified because it was incredibly creepy, like something from a horror film. The humming stayed a distant background noise. I didn't know what to do but knew I couldn't stay in the tent forever. I mustered the courage to open my tent as slowly and quietly as I could to see if I could spot anything or tell where the noise was coming from. Within 5 seconds of poking my head out, the humming stopped. It didn't fade away. It just stopped dead, as if someone had pressed pause on a recording. I was still on edge but assumed it was a prank, someone playing an audio recording to scare solo campers. I couldn't think of any other explanation. Based on that assumption, I shouted, "You're not funny." That made me feel a bit better, like I'd addressed the issue. It helped my nerves at the time. I let that hang in the air for about 10 more seconds while my head was still poking out of the tent. Satisfied, I began moving back inside. As I reached for the tent zipper, the humming started again. Same tune, but much louder, much closer, and from the completely opposite direction. My heart sank. There was no way someone could have moved from the first source of the noise to the second without me seeing or hearing something. It was perfectly quiet in the woods. Not even a breeze against the leaves. It was dark, but I could still see short distances thanks to the moonlight. My subconscious was clearly working overtime trying to rationalize this. I guess I assumed there were multiple pranksters with multiple audio recordings. I can't exactly remember my thought process because it's all a blur. For one reason or another, I stormed angrily out of the tent towards the now loud sound. It sounded as if the person humming was within 10 feet of the tent. I got up, turned towards the noise, ready to scream or even attack if necessary. That's when I saw a humanoid figure silhouetted against the tree line, about 15 feet away. It was a large, thin figure shaped like a human but way too tall and proportioned all wrong. It was huge, over 7 feet tall. Its limbs were unnaturally long, like it had been stretched out. Its head was small and rounded. The figure seemed gray, but I couldn't be sure because of the poor visibility. I couldn't make out much of its face. It was shrouded in shadow. I didn't notice any features like eyes, mouth, or nose. It stood quite still, facing directly towards me. I say quite still because it swayed slightly like a person or animal might. This was a real, living thing, not an illusion, prop, or prank. It was aware of my presence. I was paralyzed by fear. I've never felt anything like it before or since. It was a primal terror that left me cold and shaking, unable to move. I distinctly remember thinking I needed to get away but couldn't physically move. It was the most terrified I have ever been. As I first laid eyes on the creature, the humming stopped and it started humming again. But this time, it was softly singing my name in what sounded like my voice. It didn't sound right, though. The syllables were off, as if a non-human had heard speech once and was trying to mimic it poorly. I haven't described that well, but I don't know the words to do so. This can't have gone on for more than 10 seconds, but it felt like forever. I stood there. The creature stood there, motionless, singing my name. Every cell in my body suddenly switched, and I managed to turn and run as fast as I could in the opposite direction. For maybe 2 minutes, I sprinted through the woods in just my socks and PJs, with no other thought than putting distance between myself and that thing. I had no idea where I was going or how I'd make it back to my tent. When I eventually stopped, I leaned against a tree, panting for ages. The forest was still completely silent. I must have stayed by that tree for about 2 hours, waiting for my heart rate to settle, trying to calm down and decide what to do. I didn't want to go back to my tent. I was ready to leave all my stuff but needed my phone and car keys to get home. I was several miles away from anywhere. I eventually made my way back slowly. It wasn't too hard to navigate back to my tent because the trees weren't very dense. I also hadn't gone as far as I first feared. Once back at my tent, I grabbed just my phone and keys and went to my car as fast as I could. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the back seat on my phone, shaking. I didn't even try to sleep. Once the sun was up, I went back, packed my stuff, and left as quickly as I could. After that, I took a 2+ year break from solo camping, something I normally do every 3 to 4 months. So this happened last year in Virginia and is also the reason I never backpack alone anymore. I was taking summer courses at the time and we ended up with a 3-day weekend in June, so I thought it was a great time to go explore some of the Virginian wilderness and all. I did a Google search and found a state park with a trail that looked nice and let my roommate and family know the trail I was going to be on. When I got close to the park area, I saw a little outdoor shop where people hiking the Appalachian Trail stop. I went in to grab a map of the area just in case I got lost. As I was talking to the owner, he mentioned a trail that's not well known that has a pretty cool waterfall and swimming hole. This piqued my interest, so I had him show me on the map. It took me outside the state park, but he said it was a great place to go. I paid for the map and thanked the owner. I texted my roommate and parents about the new trail and I parked my car and set off on my adventure. I should note that the waterfall was going to be a side trip from my journey. I was planning 3 days, 2 nights. I started on part of the Appalachian Trail and it was pretty packed with people and some of them were really fun to talk to. As expected, as I got further and further from the main trails, I saw less and less people. Around early afternoon and 3 miles away from my destination, I noticed that it was unnaturally silent. There were no birds, no bugs, and not even wind. I had a feeling of being watched. I shook it off as me over-analyzing the situation. I got to the waterfall and it wasn't too spectacular, but it was cool to look at. Plus, it had a good-sized area to swim in, so naturally I stripped down to my skivvies and took a dip. It was pretty refreshing. As I was getting my clothes back on, I started whistling to myself. It was Chill Bill because it was stuck in my head. That's when I heard something whistle the same tune back. I thought it was a bird copying me, so I went back and forth with it and it'll repeat whatever I whistled. I thought it was pretty neat. As I was setting up camp, I couldn't shake this feeling that I was being watched again. I'd get goosebumps and my hair would stand up. As night fell, I built a small fire and lit my jet boil to make dinner. As I did this, I became hyper-aware that again there was no sound. It was just deafening silence. Some part of my brain was telling me that I'm not safe and needed to leave. I ignored it and crawled into my tent with my flashlight and book. I went to sleep without incident. When I woke up the next morning, my site was absolutely trashed. My camp stool was nowhere to be found. My bear bag with my food was cut down and the contents were thrown across the site. My first thought was a crafty animal chewed through the rope and got at the bag, but I looked at the rope and it was cut with something very sharp. Also, none of the food was even touched. I also noticed bare human footprints all around my campsite. Keep in mind that I'm at least 6 to 8 miles from a road. As I was looking at the mess, I heard a branch snap off in the distance. I turned to look in that direction. I saw nothing, but I heard that whistling again. It was the same as my whistle from yesterday, but it was different. It sounded slower and somewhat sinister. It made my hair stand on end, and this is when I listened to my instincts to get the hell out. It sounded like it was a little off in the distance, so I packed up my camp as fast as I could. The whistling got closer as I finished stuffing the tent into my bag. I didn't bother with putting anything away properly. The whistling was incessant and sounded like it was coming for all directions. I got fed up with the whistling, so I stood and I yelled into the woods, "Shut up," and "What the hell do you want?" Whoever it was stopped whistling and it was quiet for a moment. Then it repeated what I shouted in my voice. It sounded just like me, but it was deeper and distorted like it came from an old TV. After I heard this, I immediately threw my pack on and ran to the direction from where I came. I heard it moving just behind me and quickly switching between the whistle and my voice. It felt like it was toying with me by not coming too close but not being too far. Eventually it sounded like it got further and further away from me. Then it stopped suddenly. When it stopped, I turned around, but I immediately wished I didn't. That's when I heard the most bone-chilling screech ever coming from right next to me. That's when I started running again. I didn't look. I only ran. Less than a half-mile after, I ran into a couple that was also backpacking. They saw the look of terror in my face and asked if that was me that screamed and asked if I was okay. I told them about what happened, and they decided to not go down where I just came from. We moved to a more populated trail as quickly as we could. As soon as I got back in my car, I drove to one of the park ranger stations and reported what happened. Since the site was off park grounds, they told me it wasn't in their jurisdiction, but they'll send a ranger to investigate. The ranger station's parking lot run right up to the woods, and when I was getting into my Jeep, I heard the Chill Bill tune coming from woods just in front of me. I never drove so fast in my life. When told my roommate why I was back after only one night, all he said was, "Bro, I'm never going camping with you." My parents owned 35 acres of property in the deep Rockies about 2 to 3 hours from our home. We spent as much time as we could camping there as we all loved it. It was secluded and beautiful, and we had a lot of freedom there as kids. My parents were experienced campers and backpackers, both having grown up in the mountains. One day, we headed up at night, arriving at the property around 9 or 10 p.m. We were all tired and started to unpack the tents and gear from the car. The minute we got out, we all felt something strange. It didn't feel normal or good. We had encountered wild predators before and knew the feeling of being watched, but this felt like being watched from all sides. We also noticed that there were no sounds. It was dead silent. Normally, we would hear insects, occasional owls, nighthawks, or bats, and just the general hum of a forest. But there was nothing. We nervously laughed and maybe mentioned a few things, but got to work setting up our tents nearby. This is when the real strange stuff started to happen. We began to hear rustling in the branches around us, about 10 feet off the ground, it seemed. It almost sounded like large creatures, like monkeys or raccoons, jumping from tree to tree loudly, and many of them. I have never seen raccoons do something like that, and these sounds were clumsy, unlike birds. It got louder and louder and became extremely unnerving. By this point, the tent was set up, and my parents put my brother and me inside, telling us to stay there. They went out with flashlights, trying to make sense of this bizarre activity. As they were outside, we started to hear bizarre calls. I have never heard anything like this before or since. Honestly, it almost sounded like humans mimicking some kind of primate holler or screech. There was an odd human-like aspect to it. It was like they were calling and responding to each other from every direction, along with the branches cracking and rustling. My parents came back to the tent and told us they couldn't see anything at all. I remember how shocked and frightened my mom looked, and it scared me because she was tough and would stalk bears to get a good photo. Both my parents were not easily frightened in nature or at all. We were all huddled together in the tent, confused, scared, and unsure of what to do. The sounds were so loud and everywhere that it almost sounded like some crazy storm outside. Our dogs were cowering between us, totally freaked out. My dad decided to go out again, and I remember as he finished unzipping the tent, the sound stopped. Just like that, in an instant, and the oppressive, weird feeling was gone. He and my mom went out again to investigate and found nothing, except fallen branches and some strange marks up high on some trees. They came back, talked us down, and somehow managed to get us to sleep. We still talk about this to this day. None of us know what happened and have no explanation. And there we have 3 true creepy camping experiences from real people. Please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more horror stories. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.